Now we come to ethical dilemma number 3, which is related to the first two. And we're going to call this halftime because now comes the entertainment. Come away with me, Lucille, in my merry Oldsmobile. See the USA in your Chevrolet. And for Marianne and me, fun, 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 till her daddy took the T-Bird away. Americans love their cars. I've lived in Brazil, Taiwan, Guyana, and Australia. Americans love their cars like no other nation on earth. And the baby boomers who are now beginning to collect Social Security began to drive young. They drove far, they drove frequently, and they drove fast. And now they've got slow reactions, they can't see and they can't hear, and so now they've cranked the Beach Boys up to unimaginable levels of volume. This is really one of the most difficult questions we can come up with in social ethics. On the surface, I can turn this into a total comedy routine, but I won't. But on the surface, driving seems to be a simple question, but it raises ethical questions that go very far below that surface. Two questions of social ethics for driving are, does individual freedom always outweigh the common good? And is driving a right or a privilege? Now, for those of you who have nice, happy, Norman Rockwell-like Thanksgiving dinners, ask either of these questions at dinner. It'll increase the stress level beyond what you're already dealing with. But these are the questions that are at the heart of the debate about driving. There are 14 million drivers over 70, and as you saw on that graph, it's around 75 that the curve begins to move up. And I'll show you some other statistics a little bit later on. 72% of the elderly live in suburban or rural areas. Now, I live in Weston, Massachusetts, 17 miles from downtown Boston. 12 miles from Boston College, which is also the top of Heartbreak Hill for the Boston Marathon. 6 miles to go once you pass BC. But without a car, you're stranded in Weston. It's 2 miles to the train, and while you could maybe walk to the train because it's downhill, you ain't going to walk back up that hill. So that it is crucial that people living in those settings be able to drive, even to do simple things like go to the supermarket. I used to live in rural Vermont. The day the car broke down, it was like house arrest without the Lindsay Lohan ankle bracelet. But motor vehicle injuries are the leading cause of injury-related fatalities among 65 to 74-year-olds and the second leading cause of death over the age of 75. I think the leading cause of death over that age is falls. The elderly, 13% of the population, are involved in 18% of fatalities, and individuals with dementia are 2.5 to 4.7 times more likely to be involved in an MVA, a motor vehicle accident. These are startling statistics. It's a very hard thing to test for. There's no agreement on what are the parameters or when should we stop the driver's license. You want to have fun, introduce this topic at your Christmas dinner. You'll never have people come to your house for the holidays again. For many elderly, losing their license is like being placed under house arrest. My mom was a wonderful driver. My father was horrible. And he admitted it. So did the whole family. My mother loved to drive, and she was very good. And when she died at 93, and when she was 85 or 86, she phoned me one day. And I was in my room working on a paper. And she said, "Guess what?" I said, "What?" "I'm going to quit driving." I stayed very cool and calm. I said, "Well, what made you decide this?" And she said, "Well, I have neuropathy in my feet, but I realize I can't tell if my feet are on the gas or the brake. And if I hurt someone, I could never live with myself." So we chatted a little bit more. She filled me in on the gossip. When I hung up that phone, I looked like I was at cheerleader tryouts because I didn't have to have that conversation with my mom. She quit driving voluntarily, and that was it. She stopped right there. Kept the car for 2 years, good for me, but she quit right then and there. She had, well, a bit more than lucky. Her baby sister did the same thing, but then began to second guess herself, but the car was already gone. What about the responsibility to maintain confidentiality? HIPAA. What about encouraging independent living and civil liberties versus the question of the common good? When do we have to get people off the road because they've now presented a danger? A few years ago in Boston, a 75-year-old was driving and drove right through the plate glass window of the radiation oncologist's office where she was going for an appointment. She killed the oncologist. And if you read the papers from a couple of select metropolitan areas, very few weeks will go by where you don't see some kind of accident of that type. Petaluma, California, when the guy drove through a bunch of school kids, and it goes on and on. There are reasons why these things happen. Sydney Opera House, July 31st, 2011, the best picture I've ever taken in my life. That was a 40-second exposure. I skipped dinner to get that picture. Now, elderly driving, we do change our driving habits as we age. We drive fewer miles. We drive slower speeds, sometimes to the utter annoyance of everyone behind us. Restrict to better conditions. Daylight. I try to avoid driving at night on unfamiliar roads now because I can't see worth a damn. I can say that too because I'm a Jesuit. And the Pope understands. Restricting to good weather. Avoiding rush hour and avoiding superhighways. Now, driving I-95 through New York is crazy. And limit to driving locally, but that can be very problematic sometimes too. Now, here's a list of the average miles driven per age. 16 to 19-year-olds, about 7,000 miles. Here in the 25 to 50, it's about 13,000 miles a year. These are the prime working years. With retirement in around here, the number of miles driven annually begins to diminish. And at around 70, it's probably about the same as 16 to 19, and then it goes down even further up to 85. To evaluate driving, you've got to look at per miles driven. Per 100 million miles driven, 16-year-olds and 85-year-olds have the same rate of accidents. Look what happens from 19 to 24. It's called the learning effect. You learn not to speed, etc. And things stay pretty good. This is the family raising years. You don't take a whole lot of risks when you've got 3 kids at home. But things begin to change. So look at these two graphs. This is the prevalence of dementia, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80, 85, up to about 30% in this particular graph. 60 to 64, 60, these graphs could be superimposed with the fatalities per 100 million miles. It does go up. We somehow tolerate this rate from 16-year-olds, but it gets harder to tolerate when you know things are only going to get worse as time goes on. Individuals with AD who reach what is called the clinical dementia rating scale of 1 are generally unsafe drivers, and if they're not, they will become unsafe within a year or so, and they need to be reevaluated very often and very closely. The relative risk of crashes for drivers with stage 1 is the equivalent of driving with a blood alcohol level over 1, which is the old level for DUI in some states until the national standard of 0.1. I think the standard is 0.08. Drivers with early CDR, stage 1 have a risk that is similar to 16 to 19-year-olds, which is very high, or a blood level of 0.08, which is now, I think, the national standard for DUI, whereas it used to be in some states 0.1, which is what it was in Pennsylvania. So we're looking at a fairly, and this is from the journal Neurology, which has spent a lot of time looking at this question. So driving can be hazardous, and we have to balance public good, common good, the safety of the individual versus the individual's ability to be self-determining. Many people say, well, you know, mom's not a problem. She only drives to church, the supermarket, the beauticians, and to my house to see the grandkids.